episode of the TCLF One-on-One series. Through the One-on-One series, we aim to interact with the best legal professionals from India and around the world. Today, we have another fantastic guest with us, Ms. Upasana Dasgupta. Ma'am is currently a PhD student at the Institute of Air and Space Law, McGill University, Canada, and she has also completed a master's in air and space law from the very same university. Prior to that, she has worked with some of the top law firms in the country, and she has won numerous academic accolades throughout her journey. Ma'am, it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you, Shashwat. This is an honor to be here.
Ma'am, just to set the tone for the conversation, it can be observed that space law is not a very popular field amongst Indian law schools, to be particular. So, what made you, interested in the field? What was your first encounter like with the field of space law?
So my first encounter with space law was actually the Manfred Labs moot court competition, which I think is the first space law space first encounter for a lot of Indian students. Manfred Labs being one of the most prestigious international moot competition. I mean, that was one of the reasons we chose that moot as a team. But then once I started uh, researching on it, I was fascinated by uh, by this field. So basically that, and then so when I did my man flags, that was 2010, 2009. So that is like long time back. But it's also true that during that time there were less Indian universities dealing with space law. But now I think there's more awareness, little more awareness since then.
Right. Like in the recent times, many Indian law schools are indeed coming up with research centers. For example, GNLU has a fantastic center, and NALSAR also. So yeah, there is a growing popularity of space law in India, but it's still at the very nascent stage. So, ma'am, you've completed a master's in air and space law, and you're also currently, pursuing your PhD in space law. So, can you tell us something about your research work in the field? What are the primary areas that you have worked upon?
So the primary areas that I've worked upon are a lot on international space responsibilities, their state responsibility for states. So that is right now what I'm working on, and also space environmental pollution. And so basically, if you ask me what is my thesis, right now my thesis is basically international state responsibility for preventing collisions in outer space. So that is what I am working on right now. My master's thesis was on responsibility and liability also, but it was on uh, a responsibility and liability for sale of satellites which are already on orbit. So that's
Right.
something I've worked on, but there are various other projects I've been working as a research assistant. So on space law in general.
I think space, environmental pollution, and as you're talking about collisions, is a very interesting field. We can see that with the development of small satellites and majorly, even private sector players trying to launch their own satellites, we can see that many satellites are going into space right now, and that is causing somewhat a space traffic, I should say. So that's a very interesting field to work upon, ma'am, and I wish you all the good luck with your thesis as well. So, ma'am, an Indian space legislation has been long overdue. Uh, there have been discussions, there have been some drafts, but we do not have a concrete space policy, I should say. So, what have been some of the challenges for India as far as formalization of a space policy or law is concerned?
So I am glad that you asked that question because right now, at the moment, India is trying to come up with space policy. And so there was a draft on communication satellites, on communications that came in November, that came in October, I think. Yes, in October. And there's one in remote sensing that came in November. And but these are still drafts and under commenting phase, and they're trying to have a comprehensive way of dealing with the space problem. And also you must be aware that at the moment they have created a body so that, to distinguish more between the commercial space activities of the government
So,
and
like,
also
what have,
private,
yeah,
and also
like, what have been
private.
the major challenges? Yeah,
So, what are the main challenges with regards to? I'm sorry, I didn't get.
An Indian space legislation. Like, why has there been so much of a delay? I should say.
I think there's a question of whether there is a necessity. That is the most important thing. I think I mean, as lawyers and as policymakers, I think they all agree that we need, only when we need a legislation we should have it, and law generally acts reactively rather than proactively, generally.
Right.
So the question is that because till now almost all the activities are done by ISRO or Antrix, which is the commercial arm. So till now there was not much necessity. There were private players which were interested, and they would take part, and like manufacturing of satellites, they would take part in the space business. But the ultimate responsibility and the ultimate launching is done by the government. So I think that is
Right.
why there was a question of whether there was a necessity. But right now India is trying to right now there is a change, and India is trying to encourage its private sector to enter the space field. And we also must understand there's a question of budget for the government, right?
Right.
Because like where they allocate the budget, so sometimes it is necessary to involve private sector so that the government does not have to spend as much on space sector. And this has been the case in US. So I'm not saying that that's the same case in India, but that may be the case in certain sectors.
Right, right. That might just be the case. Right. So, moving on, man, there have been a lot of interesting developments in the field of space tourism as well. We've seen that companies like SpaceX and even Amazon has some plans for commercializing the entire thing and letting people travel to space in the near future. So, and quite normally, so this space tourism part will also raise some new legal challenges. For example, the territoriality principle will come into the question of jurisdiction and how the laws will interact. So, like, can you highlight some of can you first of all tell us more about what space tourism actually involves and what will be the kind of legal challenges that will come up?
So the space tourism, or the suborbital tourism that we talk about, if firstly it can really revolutionize the travel industry, because if I am not sure of the exact timeline, but what it says that you can move from Tokyo to New York in less than 2 hours or even less than that. So generally it takes a lot of time. And Mm, uh, mm, so it would really, because you don't have to go against the air pressure. So I guess that is the reason that it would really make the travel faster, and that's
Right.
something that's a need of the day at the moment. Even more because COVID, if pandemic, if it's going to stay, then there's a lot of process to clean, and so that takes a lot of time in travel time. So if at least the flight time is reduced, that would incentivize the uh, airline consumers to travel.
Right.
So that is one thing. But the space tourism has a lot of issues. The question is whether is it to be governed by air law, or is it to be governed by space law?
Right.
So air law and space law are, even though they deal with geographical regions which are not too far from each other, but the
Right.
problem is that they are governed by completely different principles. Air law is governed by aviation law is governed by sovereignty of the state. So a
Right.
state has complete sovereignty over its airspace, whereas outer
Exactly.
space is governed by freedom of exploration for all and non-appropriation of the outer space.
Right.
So, so So if that is the problem, then it is obvious to not to a general person that there is a boundary. But the thing is, there is no boundary at
Right.
the moment. There's
Right.
some states are trying to have that in their legislation. For example, Australia, I think, is one of the state which said 100 kilometer is where space starts. But then there not all states have been taking consistent views, and most of the states have not been taking any views at all. So the question is that whether suborbital tourism is governed by space or air. So that is a very important question. Uh,
Right.
and it really depends on the country to country and what stance they are taking. But to my understanding, I think it should be the functional. So if the point is just to travel from one country to another, then perhaps it makes more sense to govern by air law rather than space law.
Right, and I think another reason why the question of governance is very important is because ultimately you have to regulate these players, because what they do in space will have consequences for the entire world, because space debris is a lot of concern, and for example, some unfortunate incident happens, or you have to regulate these private players, because at the end of the day it's nothing but an exploration for them as well. So I think it's very important to regulate.
I have to agree and disagree on certain points. So
Right.
regulation, yes, there is need for regulation. But if there is something happening on space, though, if there is a damage, like for example collision,
Right.
in that case, in that case, what happens is that um, there is already a liability convention there which says
Right.
that if there's a collision between two space objects or a space object or something else, then there's certain money has to be paid, compensation has to be paid. So there is already some law regarding that, whether it has to be regulated more or it has to be regulated more properly and it has to be
Right.
implemented. Yes.
I think the liability lies upon the launching state, as far as I can recall.
Yes.
I'm not sure. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, moving on, ma'am. There has been a lot of discussion. In fact, we had a contribution on our blog on this theme as well. There has been a lot of discussion about data governance in outer space, like what laws govern data in outer space. So, can you shed some light upon that? What the
So
entire issue is about?
So the outer space data, so the data, the from where it is accessed, it would generally be a satellite, or for
Right.
example, in ISS, it would, if in the International Space Station, it would be in a module which belongs to a country. So the outer
Right.
space law is very clear that the module or the space object basically where the state of registry has the state of registry or the launching state, it has some control over it, and the state of registry has retains jurisdiction and control over
Right.
the satellite or the space object. So at the moment, I think it would generally be governed by the state having jurisdiction and control.
Okay. And like just to follow up on that question, uh, like this is a very important question. I've read a lot of articles on this, a lot of debate happening over this as well. Like, do you think that the present international framework with regards to space law, the very basis being the Outer Space Treaty and the related conventions, is it adequate, or is it satisfactory in order to deal with these emerging issues? Because we can see that technology is constantly evolving and law has to move in pace with the technology. There has to be some proportional run basis for the same. So do you think that it is adequate at the moment? If not, what are some of the gaps and what is the way forward in your opinion as a researcher?
So to answer the adequacy, it's a long discussion, but I would say that Outer Space Treaty and the related treaties, they provide a base framework. There's no doubt about it. But of course, it was entered at a time in 1950s, 1960s, and 1960s, 1970s. And so at that time, of course, we could not guess that the technological development would reach to this extent. But since then, like since the 1960s and 1970s, there have been no hard treaty law entered into, and there has been a little what do you call it, I mean, less
Development in terms of law. Yeah.
less deference to the to having a more treaty law. So there are soft laws, like we have the long-term sustainability guidelines. We have other we have the space debris guidelines that we the copiers that was entered into. There are many soft laws, but the question with
Right.
soft laws and the problem with soft laws is, of course, that the question of their binding nature. So there has been no
Right.
treaty law. So the question is the COPIUS, which is the forum where laws are entered into, the space laws are entered into. The question is whether there have been a lot of questions in recent times whether it is adequate. But I think it is not just the question of whether the procedure is good. It's also a question of the will of the states.
Absolutely, ma'am. That's something that I would completely agree upon. And this was a very enriching conversation for me, and it was a very interesting conversation because space law as a field is very interesting if you really get into it, because it is bound to develop and it is bound to become more popular because of the increasing activities in the space. We can see the countries are shaping up their space policies as well, and they have numerous plans. So, do you have any piece of advice for space law enthusiasts as to what should be the course of action and where just to find the inspiration?
I think the inspiration for space law, and I have to say this, very emphasize on this, because is international law. So space law, unlike aviation law, is not very different from international law. So the inspiration of it is international law. So if you like space law, it's the chances are you would like international law too. And also, I guess a little excitement about what is happening in space is also something that adds to it.
Thank you so much, ma'am, once again for joining us. And uh, it was truly an honor and it was a very enriching conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.